Welcome to this podcast from the International Dialogue Initiative. IDI is an international multidisciplinary group comprised of psychoanalysts, academics, diplomats, and other professionals who are working to understand the psychological barriers to peace, to suggest interventions, and to promote dialogue. I'm Ed Shapiro. I'm a psychoanalyst, a family therapist, an organizational leader, and a consultant. My colleague, Ford Rowan, is a journalist, a lawyer, a consultant, and an educator. Both of us are founding members of IDI. In this podcast, we will focus on uncertainty, disunity, and injustice, all of which are emerging in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Uncertainty, disunity, and injustice all characterize the world we're living in. At the moment, after an extended period of being locked up in our homes, we're being told that it's okay to go back to work and to school and to shopping malls at the same time as people are dying and the pandemic numbers are spiking upward. Protesters against racial injustice are marching across the country, across the world, and there's a demand to defund the police. Our economy is under stress, and many of our communities are traumatized. Being filled up with feelings that we can't sort out is a shared experience. You all know about it. Ford Rowan has a breadth of experience to bring to this discussion. Let me just point to a few of them. Ford chairs the National Center for Critical Incident Analysis, a research center founded at the National Defense University Foundation. Well before this current crisis, he authored a report entitled Weathering the Storm, Leading Your Organization Through a Pandemic. He knows a lot about the experience of being locked up, since he's very active in the prison ministry, spending many hours with people who are locked away from the rest of us. And at the beginning of his career as a reporter, Ford covered the integration of the University of Mississippi. So you're about to hear a conversation between someone whose expertise is in listening and someone who is engaged with the breadth and depth of social irrationality. This pandemic, like many massive social crises, has exaggerated all of the fissures in our society. Already existing divisions around race, around income, and politics have become chasms. Let's start by talking about the crisis that has precipitated all of these feelings. Ford, talk to us about what you've learned about pandemics.
Well, one of the things that I've learned about pandemics is it's very hard to predict when they're going to happen, and when they do, even if you know they'll sooner or later you're going to have a pandemic, it's always a surprise, and it certainly has been for us. And in fact, it's worse than the ones that we have some direct experience with. Let me back up just for a second and say how I got involved in all of this. After 9/11, I became very concerned about the anthrax attacks in the United States, and the government's response to them was largely botched. It was not the best response in the world. So we put together this group, the National Center for Critical Incident Analysis, with a number of military officers, retired, and others, to try to figure out how can we deal with a bioterror attack in the future. And one of the guys in the group, a doctor, said, actually, if we could handle a pandemic, we could handle an attack, a bioterror attack. And so we devoted a lot of time to working on that. And we ended up helping the government prior to the H1N1 2009 episode, where the epidemic was all about the spread of a flu, a virus, and we trained some public health officials to be able to communicate about the risks involved. But this one right now has even more uncertainty in it. For example, in the earlier one, we didn't close down all these businesses the way the current response has required. And then we didn't have to worry about opening them up again. And Ed, as you mentioned, one of the real problems is we told people for weeks, the other people around you may be carriers. They may have no symptoms. They may be carriers of a deadly disease. So don't get near them, isolate yourself, stay at home, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're telling people, okay, go back to work, even though the CDC and other institutions are saying it's not safe to mingle with people in large groups, at big rallies, or at the beach. And the cases are going back up in 30 of the states. Cases are spiking up again. the uncertainty is part of the reason that people are really, really worried about this. And Ed, you've thought about and seen a lot of people in your practice as a psychotherapist. Why is uncertainty so problematic for many people?
As we all know, life is uncertain. But in this pandemic, the level of uncertainty is overwhelming. We are told things by scientists, we're told things by politicians. The things don't actually go together. We are isolated in our homes. We can't even touch our families. And we're separated from all of the people around us. Around us, there are social media that is giving us all kinds of answers that don't make any sense to us. So what do people do when they're isolated like that? They look for a degree of certainty. One of the easiest ways to manage uncertainty is to project, to find blame outside. If I can locate blame in you, then I can feel relatively certain about myself because I know where the trouble is coming from. It's coming from our political leaders. It's coming from the people who have a different political leaning. The dilemmas around us give us a kind of orientation to the world by locating all trouble outside. So the combination of projection and isolation leads to a need to find ourselves in some kind of group. And it's the group formation that is actually finding our way out of this pandemic. But you've studied for the damages that polarization has done to society. The polarization that's caused by these certainties, these projections into other political parties, the racial polarization. What have you learned about the dynamics of that in society?
Well, we're certainly living in a polarized world today. And I started by worrying about the role of the news media in all of this. And it's a well-documented fact that news coverage of disturbing events spreads the kinds of feelings of concern and worry and distress throughout society. In other words, the media amplify the risks. We now have social media, which on top of all the stuff that used to be mediated by editors is wide open for opinions and for accusations and for spreading conspiracy theories. Now, I don't want to let the news media off the hook. When I first started in the news business, it was 1962, I guess it was. A long time ago, I'm old. So the rule was, don't give any opinions. My first boss said, I don't know what your political opinions are, and I never want to find out when you're on the air, okay? So I was told, play it straight. In today's news media, especially on cable, it's become extremely polarized with people more often talking about their opinions than trying to give you a fact-based, even keel to figure out what's going on. And we try to keep that in mind. And on top of that, the social media is causing all sorts of additional problems with conspiracy theories and the rest. So it increases the distress. It doesn't reduce it. If I had a better idea of what's happening, and here's the other part. Here's the other part that really bothers me. And that is that we get into a situation where we start picking the people we want to believe. And we also, because they're all disagreeing, decide who we will never believe. And my liberal friends will never believe anything Donald Trump says, okay, period. And my conservative friends won't believe anything that the deep state comes up with. Their distrust is polar on different sides, but what it adds up to is you don't have anybody you can trust. When I did some work at the Santa Fe Institute, which is a great research institution that looks at the complexity theory, how do things interact? We looked at how deception can harm society. And one of the ways, it's very easy to lose trust. It's very hard to regain it. And right now, distrust of the government on both sides of the political spectrum is making it very difficult for people to adjust to what's going on. They just don't believe one side or the other, and it becomes harder for people in the middle, who are moderates of both parties, to say, I'm not quite sure, but I'm worried, I'm scared. You've looked at group dynamics a lot. Am I on the right track, or how do you respond to the whole question of how groups do these things? Organizational issues.
Well, the dynamics of groups, from my perspective, indicating some of the ways out of this dilemma. So the protests that have emerged have been fascinating. One of the consequences of the polarization that you talked about, Ford, and the lack of ideals that mobilize people have led to this extraordinary outburst of marching against racial injustice. And I've been thinking about the dynamics of that kind of formulation. Let me tell you what I found myself thinking about. We've been isolated in our homes. We're desperate to find a way where we can touch people, to be in contact with something. But we're living in a country where the set of ideals that join us together have rapidly decreased in the face of this kind of polarization. A president doesn't stand for a set of ideals, and no longer can we find our country representing a set of ideals. As we're sitting in our homes, we're looking at the pandemic and the way in which the virus attacks the lungs. And we think about our own deaths, and we watch people dying because they cannot breathe. And the thing that affects us is an unknown force that's going to kill us by making it impossible for us to breathe. And then we watch George Floyd and his horrific death, where he says, as several other Black men have said as they're dying at the hands of a force that we can now identify, I can't breathe. So the identification that it comes from the pandemic and comes from a search for ideals that bind us together moves us into a powerful identification with George Floyd. And then we form groups. And one of the dynamics of forming groups is that we shift from seeing other people as the other. When we join a group, we begin to see them as one of us. And the differences that used to divide us begin to disappear. All of this, I think, and the pressures of having been locked up have moved us onto the streets in the service of standing for a set of ideals that bind us together. I find it quite inspiring and as a way through this kind of polarization. What do you think about it, Ford?
Well, I look, maybe it's because of my background as a reporter and a lawyer, that I look for the problems in it. And while I agree with you that there's some progress in people getting along in terms of joining together to fight injustice, I grew up in the Deep South, in New Orleans, which was a defeated nation in the 1950s. It had been defeated in the Civil War and no one had gotten over it, on either side, blacks or whites. And in fact, the easiest way for a white person whose relatives had fought in the Confederacy to justify all that was to talk about protecting our Southern way of life and perpetuating racism. It was really awful, dreadful. It's changed somewhat. Racism became less politically, culturally accepted as an overt act, although it's had a resurrection kind of recently. But I understand what it is. It's people who don't like being shamed deciding to project out all those feelings that they have against the other. And I saw it up front, and I saw it up front at the integration of Ole Miss, one of the first stories I ever covered, where James Meredith, a young Black man, was admitted by court order into the University of Mississippi. And I was there for the riots. The white students rioted after he was admitted. Okay, so I've started out with race riots and I'm still seeing them. But let me tell you something about my experience about this. And that is something I didn't know at the time, and I didn't really know until I read his book, was that James Meredith was of the same tribe that I'm from. We're both Choctaws. The Choctaws, the Indian tribe in the Southeast, intermarried with both white colonists and Black runaway slaves. And so I'm related to James Meredith. Now, you can say, oh, we're all one big race. We're one race, and I believe that. But the fact of the matter is that people don't think that way. They think about their tribe or their clan or the people that they socialize with, the ones that look like their mothers and fathers. And it's very interesting to say, let's step back and think about what we have in common instead of the other that causes us to think about what we're different at and to disparage other people because it makes us feel good. My shame goes away if I blame someone else, as you mentioned earlier, Ed. My shame is modified, mitigated in a way, if I can just say there's the blame. Look at those animals out there breaking into stores and looting them. It's always wrong. And so I understand that phenomenon. But I also, because I've done 20 years of volunteer work in prison, I understand how the pandemic has disadvantaged African Americans more than anyone else as a proportion of cases. I understand how the next biggest group of people that have been maltreated are the Hispanic workers. And then the third group that have been maltreated are the Native Americans. My grandmother was born on the Choctaw Reservation. I understand that. A lot of what you talked about was how awful the Trail of Tears was. The Trail of Tears when they forced the people of the tribes to Oklahoma, to the reservations from Mississippi and from other states in the South. James Meredith's father and family hid in the woods in Mississippi and stayed there. My grandmother and all side of my family went off to Oklahoma, and she told me all of these horror stories about the Trail of Tears. And it turned out she was born 50 years after the Trail of Tears. That had been trauma that had been transferred across generations. And I don't get discriminated against because I'm mostly white, but if you're James Meredith and mostly Black, you're still discriminated against in Mississippi and Oklahoma and Texas and all through the South. And that unfairness and injustice, you see it in prisons. You see it with the caseload of people with COVID-19. They're disproportionately affected by diseases and bad health care.
This is a deep psychological fact, actually. When we're trying to get rid of things about ourselves that we don't like, we look for obvious differences. We look for skin color. We look for things that you can see. And we locate parts of ourselves that we don't like in them and hate them and distance ourselves from them. There are two aspects of this, Ford, that I just like you to think with me about. One is the tribe notion that you define. These tribes that we belong to, with their deep, long-standing historical backgrounds and histories of trauma, unite people, as Vamik Volkan has talked about, in chosen traumas that identify them and that they cling to under times of stress. There are also things that bring people together that have to do with ideals and values. Those kinds of cutting across differences represent, I think, signs of hope that we can bring together in organizations and perhaps in society against these long-standing histories of trauma. What can you say about those differences, Ford?
Well, one of the things that we saw after 9/11 was how President George Bush helped bring the nation together, helped unite us. It wasn't earth-shattering, but it was a way of thinking about the problem as one people. Now, the problem we have right now with COVID-19 and with the questions about police brutality is that we don't seem to have leadership that's bringing us together. Ed, in your most recent book, Finding a Place to Stand, I'm going to paraphrase something that you said that I think is really important because it answers the question I think that you were asking, that we run the risk of deepening a regressive, narcissistic position of involuntarily and isolation and social isolation, including a rigid defensive position in which otherness is projected out on other people. So as you were saying, I project my blaming other people for something that really is something that I am so embarrassed about or I won't face internally. So this illusion of being internally okay, internal goodness, postpones the integration of these groups, these racial and tribal groups, so that it's hard to integrate the Hispanics who've come here because they were following the American dream, like my ancestors were, some of my ancestors, the Irish side of my ancestors were. And some people can't identify with anyone whose skin is a different color. It's really a sad thing. And I think you've identified it, because there is I think an epidemic of narcissism that's infected a lot of us. And the main thing is to try to avoid falling for it, because it blinds you to the reality of life. Erik Erikson said at one point that growing up requires us to take our internal ideas about everything else and start recognizing the facts that other people have other ideas. Now, I've summarized that in a little bit unfair way, but basically he's saying growing up requires you to say, it's not just my idea of the universe. It's not just my idea of how everything should be. There's reality out there that I have to use to make this come together, to give me a better idea of the future. And I have to tell you my own view. My own view is that the current president of the United States is so narcissistic that he can't accept facts that don't fit the mental picture he has in his mind. And what that leads me to think, and this is my opinion only, is that when he tells something that is not true, he actually believes it. In other words, it's not like a lie, that he's going to lie, maybe wrong, but he believes it. And quite frankly, I think that's an even scarier scenario.
I think it's actually worse than that, Ford. It's not just his narcissism that's a problem. It is the systematic destruction of all of our institutions. Our institutions are the only way we as individuals gather together to do something on behalf of society. And those institutions used to represent a set of values and ideals that we all could join. They worked for us. They're human systems. They work for us on behalf of society. And the destruction of those institutions leaves us without a kind of binding togetherness. One of the dilemmas for all organizations and institutions is the loss of a sense of mission. Mission is a way of connecting the resources and needs of the institution to the needs of the society around us. To the extent that we don't craft those missions together, believe in them, hook them onto society's needs, we're lost and disconnected as individuals. But it is in that area that I think the social protests are beginning to bring us together. I can't speak about the psychology of our president, in part because it's so obvious to all of us. You don't need a clinician to see it. But for me, the thing that is the worst is his focus on himself and his relentless destruction of our holding institutions that give us some chance of coming out of this mess.
I have a number of friends that are very worried about what they call the deep state and the conspiracy theories that you hear a lot about that are mostly debunked. But the thing that bothers me is that the way you get past that is by meeting people face to face. And I don't do psychotherapy, and that's not my skill set. But I do group stuff, group sessions in prisons. And we have people who are white and black, and we have people who are Hispanic, and people who can barely speak English, and all the rest. And we get them together and talk about things. And we don't try to tell them what they should think. I mean, you know, we don't come in here and say, now here's what you need to do. We come in there to say, what can we do to help you? And why don't you talk about what your fears are, your hopes are, your dreams are? And listening to each other has a way of bridging those differences. I mean, I've watched people who, in a bunch of years of doing this, I've watched people who come in and say, I don't like these guys over here. You know, they're a different color than me. And I've heard them come out after a few years, actually, sometimes a meeting weekly, saying, you know, now I get it, I understand. They don't always love each other, but they tolerate each other. And we don't have enough of that kind of conversation. And part of it, I'm not blaming the technology completely, but part of it is it's easier to tweet something or text something or post something on Facebook or Instagram or one of those things. It's easier to do that than to actually confront people face to face and listen to them. And you mentioned earlier, Ed, when you were introducing the program that we're doing right now, you mentioned the business of listening. We need more listening and less talking in this country. And let's listen to each other and stop making pronouncements. But I don't know how we manage that.
actually think, Ford, that when you go into the prisons, it's more than just listening, although listening is terribly important. You're going into a place, an institution, where people have been thrown out by society and labeled by society as not one of us. And when you go into the institution, you represent us. You represent the society as a member of society, and maybe even as a member of an organization that has a set of values and ideals. You say to these prisoners, you're one of us. You're not excluded. Let's bring it together and think about the larger world that you're actually a valued part of. That's a centrally important aspect of listening.
Well, let me give you a story. I used to be a reporter, and then I practiced law for a while. I stopped. I'm a recovering lawyer now. But I've always liked cases and stories, and I'm going to give you one that from prison. We had a guy in prison that said he wasn't 100% religious. And I said, what's that mean? You're not supposed to ask curiosity questions, but he said, I'm not a 100% Christian. I said, okay, well, what are you saying? And he told me that he made a promise to his brother who was dead and had been killed in a drug deal that went awry and had been murdered. He said, I made a promise to my dead brother that if I ever caught any of the sons of bitches that killed him here in prison, I'd kill him. I'd surprise him, I'd kill him if I ever found one, okay? Well, years and years passed, he was in prison for 46 years. And he was become a mentor for young guys and helping them learn how to survive in the prison atmosphere. And he was really a good guy, a terrific, nice human being. And he'd matured and changed and been transformed in prison. And one day, he told me this story. He said, I've had a cellmate, and I never realized it. And he was putting his books and papers on his bunk because he'd been told you got to leave to go to another prison. They move him around a lot to break up the gangs. And this guy, he looked and saw while the guy was out of the room, this was one of the guys convicted of murdering his brother. He was living with a murderer. Well, then I really asked a curiosity question. What did you do? And he said, I had half an hour to think about it. And when he came back, I said, I figured out who you are. And I've decided to forgive you. And the other guy didn't realize they had both had very common last names. Didn't realize the relationship that. And I asked this man, I said, why did you change your mind? And he said, I realized I needed to help my brothers in prison, my community. If I'd let them down by trying to hurt this guy, they'd have said you were a fake all along. So the idea of community, that we're all one, dominated his thinking. And I know forgiveness isn't always possible, and sometimes it's really a bad idea to promote it because it can slow down just getting along. But to me, that was the answer to the question. How do you just simply start listening, understanding, and if possible, forgiving? And the idea is about community. And in our society today, with all this electronic stuff, it's becoming increasingly easy to lose the sense of community, of the larger community. And you in your book, talking about mission and how important mission is a way to bring people together. If we have a common mission, it helps to build community. I'm sorry to take so long to talk about that, but I just think that story was one of those most eye-opening things that ever happened to me. Made 20 years of going to prison seemed like, wow, what a great experience.
It's a wonderful story, actually, Ford. One of the ways of thinking about that event is that this man, this prisoner, belonged to a community of prisoners. And that membership for him became more powerful than his membership in his family. So that loyalty to the family and revenge feelings about the murder of his brother took a secondary place in relation to the brotherhood that he found in the prison. Amazing story, actually. You quoted Erik Erikson a while ago. Erikson, among other things, defined integrity as our commitment to the most mature meaning we can discover. It has to do with bringing all parts of ourselves together, among other things, the various groups and organizations that we join and the missions that they stand for. I'll tell you one quick story to try to match the story you gave. It was told to me by an Englishman from South Africa, a black Englishman who was a social worker. He was riding in a bus at the time of the firemen's strike, where there was chaos all around and there were racial tensions in the community of London. On the bus was a white bus driver and a group of black teenagers and other white passengers. He was the only black male adult. And they were hassling, the kids were hassling the white bus driver. And he got anxious about it. And he said to himself, why do I have to do this? He was the only black man. And the white passengers weren't doing anything to stop the kids. There was racial tensions that were inhibiting them. And he decided to stand up and tell the kids to cut it out. And as he reflected on it, he thought about the various groups that he belonged to. He was a member of the Church of England, whose mission was bringing society together. He was a social worker that attended to the disunity in society. He was a father who recognized the need of these adolescents for a paternal presence. And his integrity required him to act. In order to act as a citizen, you have to begin to recognize that I am at stake. What I see out there is not these people are at stake, but I am at stake. I am identified with the social need that's in front of me, and I can then act. These are the kinds of dynamic psychological backgrounds to the people standing up in society and taking charge of what's happening to them.
I love that story. And I love the fact that he had to take a risk. We started this little discussion about talking about risks. You have to have the ability, I hope we have the ability, I hope I have the ability, I'll own this. I hope I have the ability to take the right risk when I see an injustice happening. And that does require some risks. I saw that in the civil rights marches that I covered as a reporter, where people were taking risks. And some of my white friends and some of the white clergy wouldn't take the risk of marching with them, and clergy from the North substituted. But they were all taking a risk. I mean, I covered some of the litigation involving the 3 Freedom Riders who were murdered by law enforcement people in Mississippi. And I think we all have to take some risks now to stand up for the idea that we're not going to disadvantage racial minorities, whether they're the Blacks, the Hispanics, the Native Americans, or foreigners, or whoever. We're going to try to treat people decently. And that's a risky thing sometimes. And I'll tell you though, it really is an important risk to take. And we have to take it in our healthcare system too. There are enormous disparities in healthcare. One of the reasons that African-American deaths are so much higher with COVID is the pre-existing conditions that they're not getting treated. We have a really decrepit healthcare arrangement right now in the United States. But that's my personal opinion. You're the MD. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but that's my final thought for the day. We have disparities in the way we treat people, and we need to fix it, both in the criminal justice system and in the healthcare systems that we've been discussing.
I think that we have come to the answer to the questions we raised at the beginning. This podcast is about uncertainty and isolation and disunity. The solution that we're talking about has to do with finding something that matters that we can join and overcoming our uncertainty by recognizing that I am at stake here. This is a solution to narcissism, to disconnection, to finding one's integrity in relation to a set of values that actually matter and that we can take the risk to stand up for. Thank you for joining me in this podcast. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.